Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, recessions. The world's been in one or is in the midst of one, and even if it is not officially in one right now, it's a bit meaningless not to call it a recession because of the size of the economy is so much smaller than it was. And we know for sure that Europe is in the midst of a double dip recession. So we've had recessions before, but not like this massive economic downturn that we've got right now. So what's so different, apart from COVID-19, of course? And what have been the most common causes of recessions in the past? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Welcome along. Well, we know the 2008 financial crisis was brought about by the financial sector. God bless them. The subprime mortgages from the mortgage lenders Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac basically packaging up those dodgy loans as mortgage-backed securities in ways that hid the true risk involved in lending. But we're in a very different place now. And yet, GDP has fallen more than any time since the Second World War, but we're expecting a rapid recovery. And whilst government spending is at unprecedented levels, nobody seems too worried about it. So does that mean, Steve, that we haven't got too much to worry about? I mean, this is a very different recession to previous recessions, isn't it? Because if we look back at what causes recessions, which ones are the worst, do you think? Which ones leave the economy the most deeply scarred?
Oh, it's always the ones involving credit. When you have a credit boom followed by a credit crunch. And that was the classic story with 1929. It was the classic story with 2007, because in both cases you had the huge levels of private debt compared to surrounding periods, but you then had the growth in debt, which is credit, the annual change in debt. I define, and accountants define that as credit. I've got a dispute with some of my economist friends, and you can use the words interchangeably. Debt is what you owe. Credit is how much more you owe over a particular period of time. And if you look at the 2007, the rate of change of private debt hit in America, which I'll use as my benchmark all the time, hit 15% of GDP. Now, that's the highest it's ever been in the history of American capitalism.
Right.
So you go right back to 18.
What happened then is that because as it keeps on rising, banks have got to try and find new ways to perpetuate that, which is why we got the whole repackaging up of dodgy loans, because you had to go after the dodgy loans because everybody else had already borrowed.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that was all happening sort of between 2000 and 2005. And the level of household that actually peaked in 2006, and the fact that it turned down despite all the encouragements that were out there was a bit of a sign of what was to come. But the basic story is you go from a high level of positive credit to a high level of negative credit, and that's what gives you a financial crisis. So in 2007, you went from credit being 15% of GDP on the positive side to -5 on the negative. And then you look back at the
because the growth is slowing. So in effect,
it plunges. It goes positive to negative. Yeah.
And you've said this so many times, haven't you? That it's that speed of growth. It's that credit, yes, rather than debt in total, which is creating the problem. Because in effect, it's all new money being ploughed into the economy, and then all of a sudden that new money stops.
And in fact, it goes in reverse. But this time, to get that situation, you normally have a credit bust. You've normally got to have a credit boom beforehand. And we had that in spades in 2007. We had it in spades back in 1929. But this time round, there was no real credit boom going on. There was positive credit, so debt was rising, but not much faster than GDP. And consequently, there was not this huge... We haven't climbed a huge cliff. So when you jump off this particular cliff we're on, you're not going to be... it's like you're in the ground and you're jumping into the hole rather than being on a cliff above the ground and you jump into the same hole. So we can have negative credit this time round. I say could, we won't necessarily will have it, but we could have it. But it won't be preceded by massively positive credit. So the downturn won't be as severe because you haven't climbed as high before it started.
I mean, sometimes people say it's really been the banks that are to blame for all of this. It was bad management practices by the banks that, governments had eased up on restrictions for banks too much so they could lend too much. The loan to value ratios that the banks are prepared to offer were eased off. I mean, is there any argument in that, or is it just the appetite for credit which had driven us to those boom times that obviously have the consequences you talked about?
Oh, it's definitely the banks. I mean, the banks definitely deserve the blame for this because they just got caught in a lending frenzy. And I remember one of our his supporters and regular listeners, Richard Vague, has plenty of information on that, having been in banking and deciding to get out in 2005 because he could see what was coming. And it was this huge increase in bank debt. And they were basically, you lend to anybody with a pulse when a euphoric period is going on. And that was certainly the case between, it goes right back to 1996, 96 to 2006, with a bit of a blip in 2000, 2001. It was just a non-stop credit orgy. And that's what got Richard to get out. He saw the amount of money being borrowed.
So the warning signs are going to be the amount of people in the marketing departments of banks, presumably. The more people they're taking on in marketing, the more they're trying to issue loans to people, the worse it's going to get.
To some extent. If you can certainly get plenty of indicators. There are things like the Americans keep tabs on the willingness to lend of loan officers in banks, and that's always a reasonable expose of what's going to come your way next. But with the 2000-2007 period, you had the state getting in there as well. So you had one of my another good colleagues in the finance sector, Doug Holland, was a complete critic of Fannie Mae, which is typical American. You're making up a nice personable name for a government institution, the Federal Mortgage Assurance Organization, whatever it was called, and they were just buying all the loans that were being created by these, first-tier lenders with third-tier products, and that just kept the whole bubble going. So you had everything, throwing credit on the fire to cause the boom in 2007, which was up till 2007, which of course bust in 2007 and went from massively positive to massively negative. So that's very much a bank-driven process.
There was another thing that happened in those years as well. Manufacturing numbers started to fall, and we've seen that ahead of quite a few recessions. There's no reason why, if you've got more, particularly household debt, that would be reflected in manufacturing. And yet it's almost as though the manufacturing sector knew that a recession was on the way. How come, do you reckon?
Oh, actually, that's intriguing. Have you got any data on that you can quote over the radio? Yeah, hit me with that first.
I'm looking at the PMIs actually. They're the numbers.
Okay,
the Purchasing Managers Index, which shows that in 2008. It was 2008 hard to tell because it was at 50 and it was going down to 45. Anything below 50, of course, means that purchasing managers are seeing it's subtraction. So it was looks like it was going down into subtraction just before then. But if we look at the last few years before COVID, so from 2018 onwards, I guess we were looking. There was a lot of recession talk around, wasn't it? So it went from 55. It was below 50. It was already in retraction territory before we hit the pandemic. I can't go back any further on the data that I've got to hand. But I'm hearing, I've been reading, just an observation that before recessions, very often we see, as a precursor, we sort of see a slide in manufacturing. I'm just wondering if you've got a theory as to why that might be.
Well, normally because there are lags involved in this sort of stuff. So, like, when you look at the level of household debt, for example, which was obviously driving the mortgage market, that didn't peak in 2007. It peaked in 2006. So what you had was the household sector was already turning down before it hit the aggregate economy, and that's partially because households had, despite the attractions of all the subprime loans that were out there and so on, they were actually slowing down the rate of borrowing, or you had people going bankrupt who couldn't hang on long enough to end up flipping the house into a rising market. So the fall in house prices and the fall in new household credit occurred before the downturn overall. And it might be the business sector has sort of, is projecting forward the rate of growth you're seeing in the household sector to begin with. So they're borrowing like crazy to finance what they're doing, both in terms of speculation and investment. But they're blindsided by the fact the household sector slows more rapidly than they expect. So you've got the business sector's borrowing to keep on financing expanding output, while the household sector has stopped its level of borrowing and is now cutting back on expenditure. And you therefore get this
falling demand,
decline in manufacturing sales before the actual crisis begins.
And that, because you're listening to the preview version of this podcast, is all you get for now. We'll be back again with another preview next week. But if you want to hear the full version of this podcast, then become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, or you can also subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Back again next week. Thanks for listening.